The road out of Verdun runs beside water for a stretch. On one side, the Meuse and the canal that keeps it company, flat and brown and slow. On the other side, the old ground, chalk, scrub, birch that came up after the shelling stopped, and the shape's artillery leaves in a landscape when it works on the same square miles for 10 months. A staff car pulls off onto the verge and stops. 3 men, a driver, an escort officer, and a passenger in the back who has said almost nothing since they left Paris. The passenger gets out. He tells the other 2 that he fought here as a young staff officer and that he would like to walk on the field for a few minutes before they go on east. This is a reasonable thing for a man of his age and his service to say, and nobody in the car has any reason to argue with the general about where he stretches his legs. He walks off the road toward the water. The driver stays with the vehicle. The escort officer watches him go and then looks at something else. Then a shot. Then, a few seconds later, possibly a second one. The accounts written afterward do not agree on how many times he fired. What they do agree on is what the 2 men found when they ran. He was in the water, face down, in a canal, or in the river itself. The sources differ on that too. They pulled him out onto the bank. He was breathing. The pistol had gone off against his temple, and the bullet had traveled across the front of his skull behind his eyes, rather than through the brain, which is the most common way this particular attempt fails. He was alive, and he could not see. The man on the bank was General der Infanterie, Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel. The day before, he had been the military commander in France. The evening before that, he had ordered the German army to arrest the SS and the SD across the whole of Paris, and the army had done it in one night without a shot fired. He was, at that moment on the riverbank, the only German officer of the Second World War who had actually carried out a coup against the Nazi security apparatus in a major city and held it for several hours. He is also the general whose signature sits on 17th Army orders from the summer of 1941, directing that reprisals for sabotage be taken in the first instance against Jewish and communist inhabitants. Both of those sentences are in the archive. This video is about the file that contains both. He was born in Berlin on January 2nd, 1886, into a family that had been supplying the Prussian officer corps with names for about 200 years. There were enough Stülpnagels in German uniform across the 19th and 20th centuries that the family produced its own genealogical volume, and there were 2 of them holding general officer rank in France during this war. Keeping those 2 apart is something a large share of the English language material on this subject does not manage, and the confusion changes who gets credited with which orders. He entered service on October 1st, 1904, as an officer candidate in the 1st Grand Ducal Hessian Infantry Regiment No. 115 at Darmstadt. He passed the officer examination in May of 1905 and was commissioned lieutenant in January of 1906. From October 1911 to June 1914, he attended the Prussian War Academy in Berlin, which is the credential that separates the men who command companies from the men who write the orders that companies obey. He was promoted Oberleutnant in the middle of 1913. 6 weeks after he finished the course, the war started. He went into it as a company commander and a regimental adjutant, was promoted Hauptmann in July of 1915, and moved on to the general staff track. He finished the First World War as first general staff officer of the 18th Infantry Division on the Western Front, which in German practice means he was the operations officer, the man who drafted the division's orders. He held both classes of the Iron Cross and the Knight's Cross of the Royal Prussian House Order of Hohenzollern with swords, and he had been wounded, and he had served at Verdun. That detail is not decoration. It is why a car stopped on that particular stretch of road a war later, and why nobody in the car found the request strange. He stayed in the 100,000-man Reichswehr, which meant he was one of the roughly 4,000 officers retained out of a wartime officer corps many times that size. He took part in the Kapp-Lüttwitz Putsch in 1920 on the side of the putschists, a fact that appears in the German biographical literature and almost never in the English. He commanded at Deutsch Eylau in 1924, was promoted major at the start of 1925, served as operations officer of the 6th Division at Münster from 1927, took a battalion of Infantry Regiment 5 at Neuruppin, and made Oberstleutnant in February of 1930. In his own time, he wrote military history and published work on the army of Frederick the Great. That is the profile of a man being groomed for the general staff, and being groomed slowly in an army that had almost no promotion slots. Then, in December of 1932, his friend General Ludwig Beck put his name forward for the Reich Defense Ministry, and everything accelerated. He was promoted Oberst on December 1st, 1932, and took over the Foreign Armies branch of the Truppenamt, the department that assessed the armed forces of other countries. He held it for 4 years. His job, through the entire period in which Germany was rearming and deciding who it would fight, was to tell the German army what the French, the British, the Poles, and the Czechs actually had. If you're finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of research is worth showing to more people. A lot of you in the comments have been asking for this one. He was promoted General Major on October 1st, 1935, handed the branch to Kurt von Tippelskirch in 1936, and on October 6th of that year took command of the newly raised 30th Infantry Division at Lübeck. General Lieutenant followed on October 1st, 1937. In February of 1938, he went back to the General Staff of the Army as Oberquartiermeister II, and from there to Oberquartiermeister I, which made him the deputy of the Chief of the General Staff, Franz Halder. General der Infanterie came in April of 1939. He never went higher. There was no General Oberst and no Field Marshal's baton. His career as a serving general lasted a little over 5 years from that promotion and ended on a rope. Now the part that matters for everything that follows. By the autumn of 1938, he was inside the group of officers planning to remove Hitler by force. The German Resistance Memorial Center in Berlin, the Gedenkstätte Deutscher Widerstand, states it plainly in his biography that by 1938 he belonged to the inner circle of Hitler's opponents in the military. This is the Beck and Oster circle, the one that intended to act if Hitler ordered the attack on Czechoslovakia, and the one that stood down when the Munich Agreement handed Hitler the Sudetenland without a war. He did not stand down permanently. Through the winter of 1939 into 1940, with the Western Offensive being planned and repeatedly postponed, the same network tried again, and Stülpnagel was one of the officers inside the General Staff who was counted as decided rather than merely sympathetic. He was in a position to be useful because as Oberquartiermeister I, he had the access, the map room, and a professional reason to talk to every army commander in the West. He also, in that same office, in the same weeks, did the ordinary work of his post. Between Christmas Day, 1939, and the 1st of January, 1940, at the Army General Staff Headquarters at Zossen, he directed the war game that tested a heavy armored thrust through the Ardennes. The red side was played by Oberst Ulrich Liss. The exercise came back with the answer that the Ardennes route was feasible, and that the Maginot Line could be turned rather than assaulted. That finding fed into the plan that broke France in 6 weeks. So the same officer, in the same building, in the same fortnight, was working on the operation that would make Hitler unassailable, and on the plan to remove him by force. The literature has never reconciled those two lines of activity into one motive, and he left behind no document that does it either. It is simply what the calendar shows. On April 30th, 1940, he left the General Staff and took over 2nd Army Corps. He held it for under 2 months through the second phase of the campaign in the West, the drive south after Dunkirk that finished the French army. If you look him up in English, you will very often see that Corps Command listed as running to June 21st, 1941. That is a typographical error that has been copied from page to page for years. The correct end date is June 21st, 1940, and it matters because the year in between is the year he spent on the armistice. From late June 1940, he was chairman of the German Armistice Commission at Wiesbaden. There's a photograph from June 30th, 1940, of him receiving General Charles Hunziker, who led the French delegation. The commission was not a ceremonial body. It administered the terms. Under those terms, France paid occupation costs that ran at around 20 million Reichsmark a day, at an exchange rate the Germans fixed at 1 Reichsmark to 20 francs, a rate that made every requisition in France cheap in Berlin. He ran that machine for roughly 7 months. German sources differ on when he handed it over, some giving December 1940 in the detailed service records, giving February 5th, 1941. 17th Army had been activated on December 20th, 1940. He took it over in the middle of February 1941 and had it for 4 months before the invasion of the Soviet Union. It went in as part of Army Group South under General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt on the southern wing, with 6th Army to its north and 1st Panzer Group under General Oberst Ewald von Kleist as the mobile arm. From July 1st, 1941, the Hungarian Mobile Corps was subordinated to him, which made him one of the few German army commanders running an Allied formation inside his own order of battle from the first weeks. What followed was, in narrow operational terms, the most successful period of his career. Between July 15th and August 8th, 1941, 17th Army worked with 1st Panzer Group and 6th Army to close a ring around the Soviet 6th and 12th Armies near Uman. Inside it were roughly 103,000 men who went into captivity, 317 tanks, both Soviet Army commanders, Lieutenant General Ivan Muzichenko and Major General Pavel Ponedelin, 4 corps commanders, and 11 division commanders. German losses across the operation ran to something over 20,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Uman is the encirclement that opened the road to the Dnieper on the southern axis, and it is what brought him the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross on August 21st, 1941. 6 weeks later, his army was on the southern flank of the Kiev encirclement, the largest single haul of prisoners taken anywhere in the war up to that point. The German count exceeded 600,000. David Glantz has spent a career pointing out that German prisoner totals for these operations counted everyone caught inside the ring: service troops, rear echelon, stragglers, and in places, civilians, rather than only the fighting strength. And the honest version of the number is that it is a German administrative figure and not an order of battle figure. Either way, by the end of September 1941, the officer commanding 17th Army had a Knight's Cross, 2 of the largest encirclements in military history on his record, and every professional reason to expect a further promotion. He was removed from command on October 4th, 1941. General Oberst Hermann Hoth took over 17th Army the following day. The official reason given for Stülpnagel's departure was illness. He was 55 years old, and he never held a field command again for the remaining 35 months of his life. No medical file has been produced that settles it. The Neue Deutsche biography entry on him states directly that the reasons for his removal have not been definitively clarified. The sympathetic biographical tradition, which begins with Heinrich Büchler's biography of 1989, attributes the departure to his rejection of German occupation and conquest policy in the East. Those are 2 different explanations for the same decision, and only one of them can be tested against paper, which brings us to what the documents from those 3.5 months contain. Start with the earliest, because it is the most contested and the most often misused. On July 2nd, 1941, the Reich Security Main Office sent out a teleprint over Reinhard Heydrich's authority to the higher SS and police leaders moving into the newly conquered territory. Inside, it is a sentence that has been quoted in the scholarship for decades. In translation, 17th Army Headquarters has suggested that anti-Jewish and anti-communist Poles resident in the newly occupied areas be used, in the first instance, for self-cleansing actions. The German phrase is Selbstreinigungsaktionen. It is the bureaucratic term for a pogrom carried out by locals with the occupier standing back. That document is reproduced in the standard critical edition of the Einsatzgruppen reports, edited by Klaus Mikl-Malmann, André Angrich, Jürgen Matthäus, and Martin Kuipers, published in Darmstadt in 2011 as Die Ereignismeldungen UdSSR 1941. I want to be precise about what it does and does not establish, because this is exactly where these arguments go wrong. The sentence attributing the suggestion to 17th Army appears in a document written inside Heydrich's organization. It does not appear in a surviving 17th Army file over Stülpnagel's name. Gerhard Ringshausen, in an article published in 2014 in the journal Kirchliche Zeitgeschichte titled Resistance and Antisemitism, the case of Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, makes the point that the Reich Security Main Office had an institutional interest in describing its own initiatives as army requests. That is a real evidentiary problem, and it has never been closed. What is not in doubt is that the SS believed, or wished it recorded, that the suggestion had come from an army headquarters, and that the army headquarters named was his. 12 days before that teleprint, on the first morning of the campaign, his army crossed into eastern Galicia. The Soviets pulled out of Lemberg, the city now called Lviv, on June 28th. 1st Mountain Division under General Major Hubert Lantz entered in the early hours of June 30th, accompanied by the Abwehr-controlled Nachtigall Battalion of Ukrainian volunteers. Inside the city, the retreating NKVD had murdered its prisoners in the jails, and the bodies were found immediately. A pogrom against the Jewish population began on the 30th and ran for days. Security in the city was not Stülpnagel's direct responsibility. It had been delegated down to 49th Mountain Corps under General der Gebirgstruppe Ludwig Kübler, whose appointed city commander, Oberst Karl Wintergerst, let the killing continue. German troops stopped the rioting on the afternoon of July 2nd, which is the detail historians point to when they say the Germans controlled the situation from the beginning and chose when it ended. The figures for Lemberg are disputed, and the dispute is about categories, not arithmetic. Dieter Pohl gives about 4,000 Jews killed in the city between July 1st and July 25th. Peter Lungerich puts at least 4,000 in the first pogrom alone. Richard Brightman gives 5,000 dead in the pogroms, plus approximately 3,000, mostly Jewish, shot by Germans at the municipal stadium. The reference volumes on the camps and ghettos give a range of 2,000 to 5,000 for the first pogrom, then 2,500 to 3,000 in the subsequent Einsatzgruppen shootings. The numbers do not line up because the pogrom, the stadium shootings, and the Einsatzkommando operations of early July overlap in time and in place, and different scholars draw the boundary between them differently. 4 weeks later, the documentation stops being circumstantial. On July 30th, 1941, 17th Army issued a directive on the treatment of the population in the Army rear area. Its provisions are these. Identified partisans were to be shot on the order of an officer without judicial proceedings. Suspect elements assessed as ideologically dangerous were to be handed over to the SD Einsatzkommandos. Where sabotage or passive resistance occurred and the perpetrators were not immediately identified, collective violent measures were to be taken against the local population. And on the question of who those measures should fall on, the order specified that the people seized were not to be selected at random, but were to be, in the first instance, Jewish and communist inhabitants. It further identified Jewish members of the Komsomol as the carriers of sabotage and the organizers of youth gangs. That is not an inference from a pattern of behavior. That is a numbered instruction on how to choose which civilians to shoot, issued by an army headquarters, and it survives. It is discussed in the German scholarship on the military resistance and the killing of the Jews in the southern sector of the Eastern Front, including Christian Streit's essay in the volume Gerd Überschär, edited in 2000, under the title Nazi Crimes and the Military Resistance Against Hitler. On September 7th, 1941, a further 17th Army order instructed that Jews attempting to cross the Dnieper bridges be arrested. In practical terms, that closed the eastward escape route out of the Army's operational area. And then there is the memorandum of August 12th, 1941, which he sent up to Army Group South headquarters, under the heading of the position and influence of Bolshevism. Johannes Hürter treats this document at length in Hitler's Heer Führer, his 2006 study of the 22 German Army level commanders in the war against the Soviet Union, which remains the single most important piece of work on this group of men. The memorandum has two halves that point in opposite directions. One calls for an intensified struggle against Bolshevism and against the international jury working above all in its interest. The other argues for reasonable treatment and adequate provisioning of the population, rather than draconian measures, and observes, in a sentence that is quoted in almost every serious treatment of him, that it has already been established that draconian measures against Jews have produced pity and sympathy for them among sections of the population. The Commissar order sits over all of this. It was issued on June 6th, 1941, distributed in its final form only to the most senior commanders with instructions to pass it down verbally, and it was formally suspended on May 6th, 1942. Felix Romer's study of it, Der Kommissarbefehl, documented a verifiable minimum of 3,430 executions from surviving unit records, and found that more than 80% of the divisions committed to the campaign carried out killings under it, roughly 2/3 of them by frontline troops and not by rear area units. The Neue Deutsche Biography entry on Stülpnagel states that unlawful orders, such as the Commissar order, were passed on by him without hesitation, and that anti-Semitic orders from him are documented. Christian Hartmann's Wehrmacht im Ostkrieg, his study of the front and the rear areas of the Eastern Army in 1941 and 1942, is the work that established how wide the variation was between individual formations in how these orders were handled. That variation is the reason a directive issued at Army level, naming the group the reprisals should fall on, carries more weight as evidence than any general statement about the Wehrmacht. It removes the discretion from the units underneath. He had held the rank of General der Infanterie for 2.5 years by then, and he had been inside a conspiracy to remove Hitler by force for 3. Here is the hinge of the whole story, and it is worth stopping on, because everything that happens in Paris afterward gets read backward through it, and everything that happened in Ukraine gets read forward through it. Between the 4th of October 1941 and the middle of February 1942, he had no command at all. 4 months of nothing, in the middle of a war, for a general officer with a Knight's Cross. Then he was given the largest occupation administration in Europe. So what can the Eastern documents actually carry, and what are they being made to carry? 4 things, in order of how solid they are. First, the July 30th directive exists, and it was issued at Army level. In German staff practice, the operations branch or the quartermaster branch drafts a document like that, and the commanding general signs it, and we have no draft, no marginal note, and no initial routing to tell us how much of the wording is his. But the signature is not a formality in this system. It is the authority under which subordinate corps and division commanders were required to act, and it is the thing the order derives its force from. A commander who signs an order and does not want it obeyed has a mechanism available to him, which is to countermand it. There is no countermand in the file. Second, the August 12th memorandum is the single most interesting document he produced, and I think it is being read too simply in both directions. Hürter's treatment in Hitler's Heerführer is careful. He notes the two halves and suggests the anti-Semitic passage functions as protective coloration around a substantive objection to how the occupied population was being handled. Barbara Cohen, in her monograph of 2008, takes the camouflage reading a good deal further. Christian Streit and Manfred Messerschmitt, in the Überschere volume, read the anti-Semitism as load-bearing, not decorative. My own reading of the structure is this. In a German staff memorandum, the operative content sits in the recommendation, not in the framing, and the recommendation in this document is for restraint in the treatment of the population, with the language about international jury doing the work of making that recommendation survivable in transit up the chain. That is an argument about how a document is built. It is not a statement about what the man believed, and I am not in a position to make one. Third, the removal in October. If it happened because he objected to occupation policy, there are 3 places that would show it. A personal acta entry, an entry in Halder's diary, which is published and which records his conversations with his own former deputy in detail, or an Army Group South War diary entry from the first days of October. No one has produced any of the 3, and the biographers who argue the political reading argue it from his later conduct rather than from a document dated 1941. That does not make them wrong, it makes their claim untested. And on this channel, that distinction is the whole point. Fourth, and this is the frame that Hürter's book supplies and that almost nothing in English does. He studied the 22 men who held Army-level command in the war against the Soviet Union in 1941 and 1942 as a group. Out of that entire set, 1 man was hanged by the regime for conspiracy against it. It was this one. The same set produced the compliance figures under the Commissar order. Those 2 statements describe the same 22 officers, and any account that can only accommodate one of them is describing a smaller army than the one that existed. One more thing before Paris, and it applies to almost everything that follows. The detailed narrative of what happened in that city on the night of July 20th, 1944, comes to us principally through one book, Wilhelm von Schramm's Aufstand der Generale, der 20. Juli in Paris, published in 1964. Schramm was a German war correspondent in the West during the war, and he built the reconstruction out of post-war interviews with the surviving participants. It is the indispensable source, and it is also, in category terms, a compilation of testimony from men who had survived a purge and had every reason to present their own conduct in a particular light. When I give you times and sequences from that night, that is where most of them come from, and that is what they are worth. The post he was given had a title and an address, Militär Befehlshaber in Frankreich, military commander in France, working out of the Hotel Majestic on the Avenue Kléber in the 16th arrondissement of Paris. He had authority over the German military administration of the occupied zone, over the field commands down through the district level, over the military courts, and over the security troops. There were roughly 300,000 German personnel in the country. The man he replaced was General der Infanterie Otto von Stülpnagel. The 2 were relatives of the same house, described in the literature both as cousins and as distant relations, and the near identity of their names has produced more confusion in the English language material than any other single problem in this story. So, cleanly, Otto held the post from October 25th, 1940, to the beginning of February 1942. Karl Heinrich held it from the middle of that month to July 20th, 1944. The autumn 1941 hostage shootings that are the most frequently cited episode of the occupation belong to Otto. The 1942 deportations belong to Karl Heinrich. The specifics of Otto's tenure matter because they set the terms his successor inherited. On October 20th, 1941, Oberstleutnant Karl Friedrich Hotz was shot dead in Nantes. The next day, Dr. Hans Gottfried Reimers was killed in Bordeaux. Hitler demanded between 100 and 150 executions for each attack. Otto shot 98 in total for the 2, 48 at Nantes, and 50 at Bordeaux. In mid-December, he had 95 more shot. In the same December sequence, French police, acting on German instruction, arrested 743 Jews in Paris on the 12th. 300 more were taken from the camp at Drancy, and 1,043 were moved to the camp at Royaleux outside Compiègne for deportation east, alongside 500 young communists marked for the same. That December roundup is regularly attributed on the internet to Karl Heinrich. It was not his. He was in Germany without a post at the time. What broke Otto was arithmetic. He had argued in writing repeatedly that mass shootings were counterproductive and that deportation was the more effective instrument, and he had also protested the confiscation of art by the Rosenberg Task Force and the SS bombings of Paris synagogues in early October 1941. On February 2, 1942, General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel ordered sharper deterrence, including the execution of a large number of imprisoned communists and Jews and the arrest of 1,000 more. Otto submitted his resignation instead. He was arrested by the British in December 1946, handed to the French, and hanged himself in Cherché-Midi prison in Paris on February 6, 1948, before he could be tried. Karl Heinrich arrived in the middle of February 1942. The service records give the 13th. Christopher Neumeier gives the 17th. Nobody in the literature disputes the month. Neumeyer's article, The Escalation of German Reprisal Policy in Occupied France, 1941 to 1942, published in the Journal of Contemporary History in 2006, is the closest thing in English to a document-by-document account of the handover, and it is built on the German-language research of Ulrich Meyer, whose work on the revision of reprisal policy in occupied France is the foundation nearly everyone in this field is standing on. Neumeyer's central finding is continuity. The change of commander did not change the policy. What changed was the vocabulary. Under Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, the military administration stopped using the word hostage in its orders and began using the formula communists and Jews. On March 1, 1942, 20 were shot after an attack on Wehrmacht personnel. On April 16th, 30 were shot under that formula, and 1,000 people were deported for forced labor. On May 1st, 28 were shot. For the two railway sabotage cases of April and May, 110 hostages were ordered shot, and between 24 and 28 were actually shot. And that gap between the number ordered and the number carried out is the kind of detail that only surfaces when somebody reads the files against each other, which is what Neumeier did. On April 10th, 1942, a decree from Hitler set the standing requirement that 500 Jews or communists be deported east after each attack. Neumeier's conclusion is stated flatly, and it is why his article is worth naming aloud. He argues that the reprisal policy in France was ideologically based and was developed before the resistance began attacking German soldiers, and that the distinction between a correct Wehrmacht and a brutal SS does not survive contact with the reprisal files. The evidence he leans on hardest for that is the raid on the 11th arrondissement of Paris on August 20th, 1941, in which roughly 3,000 Jews were arrested. That happened before the shooting of Marienhilf's assistant Alphonse Moser at the Bastille metro station the following day, which is the event usually given as the trigger for the whole reprisal system. Now the deportations, which are the part of his file that the resistance literature had the most trouble with. The essential study here is Ulrich Herbert's essay on the German military administration in Paris and the deportation of the French Jews, which traces the decisions through the administration rather than through the SS, and which is the reason this material sits inside a military history rather than beside one. 5 weeks after he took the post, on March 27, 1942, the first convoy of Jewish deportees left Compiègne for Auschwitz. At the end of May, his administration issued the ordinance imposing the yellow star across the occupied zone. In economic terms, his apparatus ran what the German documents called the dejudaification of the French economy. Of roughly 42,700 identified Jewish-owned enterprises, about 18,000 were transferred to non-Jewish ownership, and nearly 15,000 were liquidated outright. On the 16th and 17th of July, 1942, French police carried out the largest single roundup of the occupation, planned on the German side by SS officers Theodor Dannecker and Helmut Nocken. About 13,000 people were arrested. The first day's count was 2,573 men, 5,165 women, and 3,625 children. Roughly 7,000 were held in the Velodrome d'Hiver, the winter cycling stadium in the 15th arrondissement, and 6,000 went straight to Drancy. The adults were deported to Auschwitz at the end of July, and the children followed them. The totals for the occupation as a whole come from Serge Klarsfeld's memorial to the deportation of the Jews of France, which is the reference work on this, and which was compiled convoy by convoy from the transport lists. Approximately 76,000 people were deported from France in about 80 convoys. 11,000 of them were children. Around 2,500 survived. From Drancy alone, between June 22, 1942, and July 31, 1944, 67,400 were sent east on 64 transports, 6,000 of them children. There is one structural change in 1942 that the defense literature leans on, and that has to be stated accurately because it cuts both ways. Hitler decided that executive police authority in France would move out of the military administration and into the hands of a higher SS and police leader. SS Brigadeführer Karl Oberg took that post on May 5, 1942, and held it until November 28, 1944. From that point, the military commander in France was no longer the principal author of police repression in the country. What he remained was the officer who commanded the troops that the police apparatus called on, who ran the military courts, and who issued the ordinances the police enforced. Under Oberg, the shooting continued on a larger scale. 88 of 93 men ordered shot were shot on August 11, 1942. 116 were shot on September 21st. In November of that year, 160 were prepared for execution and not shot. And in June 1944, with the invasion ashore in Normandy and his own administration collapsing westward, Stülpnagel formally objected to a proposal to deport the roughly 30,000 Jews still living in Paris, and the objection succeeded. The Neue Deutsche Biography entry states it as fact. That is the last documented act of his administration before the 20th of July, and it belongs in the file next to the ordinance on the Yellow Star, which is also his. The conspiracy in Paris was not built by him alone, and it was not built quickly. His personal advisor was Oberstleutnant der Reserve Caesar von Hofacker, a Luftwaffe reserve officer whose civilian job was liaison to the French steel industry, and who was Klaus von Stauffenberg's cousin. Schramm called him the real leader of the resistance movement in the West. Hofacker's own assessment of the coup's chances, given before the attempt, was 10%. The link into Army Group B ran through General Lieutenant Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, and the German Resistance Memorial Center identifies Speidel as the route by which Stülpnagel was connected to the plotters. In Paris itself, the commandant of Greater Paris was General Lieutenant Hans von Beuneberg-Lengsfeld, who was in. So was Stülpnagel's own chief of staff, Oberst Hans Ottfried von Linstow, who had arrived from the east in April 1944. The bomb went off at Rastenburg at 12:42 in the afternoon on July 20th, 1944. Paris got the word by early evening. The Bendler Block in Berlin sent the Valkyrie signals. Hofacker's line said the thing had worked, and at the Hotel Majestic and at the Raphael, the officers of the military administration made a decision that no other German headquarters in Europe made that night. They executed their part of the plan on the assumption that it was real. Antony Beevor, in D-Day, the Battle for Normandy, sets the Paris Strand where it belongs, which is inside a campaign that was still being fought. On the night of the arrests, the German front in Normandy had not broken. The American breakout at Saint-Lô was 5 days away, and the Falaise pocket was a month off. These were officers of a headquarters that still expected to be administering France in the autumn. At 22:30 hours, troops moved. Security Regiment 1 of the 325th Security Division went into the SS and SD installations across the western districts of the city, along the Avenue Foch and the Boulevard Lannes, with elements coming through the Bois de Boulogne. Roughly 1,200 SS, SD, and Gestapo personnel were taken into custody. Not a shot was fired anywhere in the operation. General Major Walter Bremer arrested Oberg at his own desk, and Oberg surrendered and instructed his escort to hand over their weapons. Helmut Knochen, the head of the SD in France, was collected from a nightclub by a junior officer. One column of prisoners went south to Frayne prison, another north to the Fort de l'Est at Saint-Denis. The senior SS and SD officials were held at the Hotel Continental, and summary courts-martial were being prepared for them at the École Militaire. For the better part of that night, the German army held the German police apparatus of an occupied capital in cells, with a firing squad in prospect, and nothing in Berlin able to prevent it. What prevented it was a dinner 60 kilometers downriver. Stülpnagel drove out to La Roche-Guyon, to the headquarters of General Feldmarschall Guenther von Kluge, Commander-in-Chief West, and asked him to come in, to declare himself, and to open contact with the enemy in the west. Kluge had a teleprint from Keitel confirming that Hitler was alive. He had also, on his own account, and on the account of everyone else present, given the conspirators reason to expect his support if Hitler were dead. He declined, told Stülpnagel he was relieved of his post, and suggested he change to civilian clothes and disappear. That conversation and the 6 hours around it are a separate story with a separate set of documents, and it deserves its own treatment rather than a paragraph. Stülpnagel drove back to Paris, in the small hours knowing he had a city full of arrested policemen and no coup to justify it. The release order went out before dawn. The pressure came from the Navy. Admiral Theodor Kranke of Naval Group West made it clear he would put 2,000 naval personnel into the streets of Paris to break the prisoners out if the army did not let them go. By morning, every one of the 1,200 was free. What happened next is the detail from Schramm's reconstruction that everyone remembers, and it is why the Paris operation stayed officially invisible for several days. At the Hotel Raphael, the German ambassador Otto Abetz put champagne in front of Oberg and the officers who had arrested him, and a story was assembled in which the whole night had been an exercise, a precautionary measure taken on unclear orders. For a few days it held. On July 21st, he was ordered to report to Berlin. The two halves of his war are unequal in a way that is easy to miss because the eastern half is the famous half, and the French half is 4 times longer. He commanded 17th Army for 231 days, of which 104 were spent in contact with the enemy. That is, the whole of his experience of Army command in the Second World War. 1 campaign season, minus 3 weeks. He was military commander in France for 888 days, almost 2.5 years, in a post with no front line, no operational orders and no encirclements, running an administration whose principal outputs were ordinances, requisitions, court sentences, and railway schedules. The judicial machinery of that administration produced 368 death sentences for partisan activity between September 1943 and February 1944 alone. Between February and April 1944, his headquarters ran 2 large anti-partisan sweeps in the French interior under the operational names Corporal and Fruhling, which involved mass arrests and killings in the villages they moved through. In May 1944, the last full month before the invasion, the returns record 569 people shot as terrorists and 4,463 arrested. Those are the figures for the month before the Normandy landings. 6 weeks after that month closed, the same headquarters arrested the SS. What followed the failure was the largest internal purge the regime ever ran against its own officer corps. Across all the territory the regime controlled, more than 7,000 people were arrested in connection with the 20th of July. 4,980 were executed. Of those, roughly 200 were conspirators in any meaningful sense. The rest were relatives, contacts, and men whose names surfaced under interrogation. 40 days passed between the shot on the riverbank and the rope at Plötzensee. He was 58 years old. His successor as military commander in France, General der Flieger Karl Kitzinger, who had previously held the Wehrmacht command in the Reich Commissariat Ukraine, was appointed on July 23, 1944, and had the post for a little over a month before Paris was gone. The order was to report to the High Command at Wunsdorf, south of Berlin. He did not fly. He went by staff car, east out of Paris through Champagne and into Lorraine, which is a road of about 260 kilometers to Verdun, and then another 850 or so to Berlin. Whether he chose the route or the route chose itself is not recorded anywhere. It is the ordinary road east. What he said in the car is recorded in the German biographical accounts, and it is short. He wanted to look at the ground where he had fought as a young officer. Then the accounts split, and the split is worth walking through because it is a good small example of how a well-documented event still ends up with 3 versions. Susan Ottaway, in Hitler's Traitors, German Resistance to the Nazis, has him leave the car, and then the guard and the driver hear a gunshot and find him in a nearby canal. She has him blinded in one eye by the shot, with the other eye so badly damaged that it had to be removed at the military hospital in Verdun. The German account, which follows the biographical literature, has him shoot himself in the head and fall into the Meuse itself, with his companions pulling him out of the water and taking him to a field hospital, where the Gestapo arrested him. A third strand of the reporting has him fire more than once. What every version agrees on is the mechanism and the outcome. A pistol against the head, at an angle that took the round across the front of the skull rather than through it, and permanent blindness. Peter Hoffmann's History of the German Resistance is the standard reconstruction of the conspiracy in English, and it is worth saying plainly that even in the standard reconstructions, this particular quarter of an hour rests on the post-war statements of 2 men who were standing next to a car on an empty road. There was nobody else there. Then comes the detail that made him briefly one of the most consequential men in the German army, and it is the least verifiable thing in his entire file. The story, which circulates in almost every account of Rommel's death, is that while he was semi-conscious after surgery, Stülpnagel talked, and that one of the names he said repeatedly was Rommel. Ottaway gives it. The general literature on Rommel's forced suicide gives it, and the evidentiary basis for it is a report of what an unconscious man said in a hospital room, transmitted by whoever was in the room, none of whom had any reason to be truthful about it afterward. There's a second, better documented route by which Rommel's name reached the Gestapo. Hoffacker was arrested in Paris on July 26th and interrogated under torture. And according to William Schirer's account in The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, Hoffacker stated that Rommel had said, "Tell the people in Berlin they can count on me." I think the delirium story has survived because it is a better scene, and I think the Hoffacker interrogation is where the actual damage was done. And I think that because one of those two things generated a written interrogation record, and the other did not. He was moved to Berlin and held. On August 30th, 1944, he was brought before the Volksgerichtshof, the People's Court, presided over by Roland Freisler. He was blind. He was led into the courtroom. The proceedings were short, as all of them were in that series. The sentence was death by hanging for high treason. He was taken to Plötzensee prison in Berlin and executed the same day. Oberst Hans Ottfried von Linstow, arrested in Paris on July 23rd, was sentenced on the same day in the same court and hanged at Plötzensee the same day. Hoffacker was sentenced on the same day and not executed. The regime held him for nearly 4 months because a man who had talked once might talk again, and hanged him at Plötzensee on December 20th, 1944. Klug never gave evidence about any of it. On August 17th, he was relieved of command in the West, and on the 19th, on the road home near Metz, he took potassium cyanide. That was 11 days before the trial. Speidel was arrested by the Gestapo on September 7th, was held for 7 months, was handled by a military court of honor instead of being handed to Freisler, and lived. Rommel was dead by then, at Herrlingen, on October 14th, 1944. The record of what he did went through 3 distinct handlings, and the third one is recent. The first was the regime's. The investigation into the 20th of July generated a very large body of reporting from the Reich Security Main Office up to Martin Bormann, and those documents survive and were published in German after the war, under the title Spiegelbild einer Verschwörung, which translates as Mirror Image of a Conspiracy, edited by Hans Adolf Jakobsen. Everything the Gestapo established about the Paris operation runs through that channel, which means that a large part of what is known about the most successful action of the German military resistance is known because the men investigating it wrote it down for Bormann. The second handling was West German, and for about a decade it was not favorable. In the late 1940s and into the 1950s, a substantial share of German public opinion regarded the July 20th conspirators as men who had broken their oath in wartime, and the surviving families spent years arguing the point in public. The Plötzensee Memorial was dedicated in 1952. The rehabilitation, when it came, made the conspiracy foundational to the Federal Republic's account of itself, and it made certain names into institutions. Stülpnagel was never one of the front-rank names. He is in the canon, and he is a secondary figure inside it, and his file does not simplify, which is part of why. Then there is the shape of the literature itself. The reference treatment of him in German is Friedrich Christian Stahl's chapter in the first volume of Gerd Überscher's Hitler's Militärische Elite, and it runs to 8 pages, which is roughly the space the field has decided he is worth. Heinrich Buchler's 1989 biography subtitles him Soldier, Philosopher, Conspirator. Barbara Cohen's monograph of 2008 is subtitled, in the German, Eine Verteidigung, a defense. When a scholarly monograph published 64 years after a man's execution has to be constructed as a defense brief, that tells you what the state of the argument was when she sat down to write it. On the other side of that argument sits Herder's group study of the Eastern Army commanders, Christian Streit's work on the men of the military resistance and the genocide in the southern sector of the Eastern Front, and Gerhard Ringshausen's article of 2014, which takes the anti-Semitism question in his case head-on instead of around it. The volume Gerd Überscher, edited in 2000, states the problem in its title and does not resolve it, which I think is the correct editorial decision. Nazi crimes and the military resistance against Hitler. Those are 2 subjects. In this man's file, they are 1 document collection. The third handling is the one now standard in Germany. The German Resistance Memorial Center's biography of him, which is the official public text, puts both halves in the same short entry. It records that he commanded 17th Army in the invasion of the Soviet Union, and that he issued a number of orders directing severe treatment of Jews. It records that he ordered the detention of the SS and Gestapo in Paris. It does not reconcile them, and it does not rank them. What happened to the other men in the story is its own kind of record. Speidel commanded NATO's Allied land forces Central Europe from 1957 to 1963, with his headquarters back in France. Oberg was sentenced to death by a French court in October 1954, had the sentence commuted to life in April 1958, reduced to 20 years hard labor in 1959, and was pardoned by Charles de Gaulle and released on November 28, 1962. Noken was released the same year. What the archive holds on Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel is a set of documents that do not require each other's permission to exist. A War Academy record from before the First World War, a Foreign Armies branch that spent 4 years telling the German army what its future enemies had, a war game finding from Zossen that said the Ardennes would work, an army order from the summer of 1941 specifying which civilians' reprisals should fall on, a memorandum from 2 weeks later arguing for restraint toward the same population in language built to survive the journey up the chain, an ordinance imposing the yellow star across occupied France, reprisal returns from a military administration counted by the month, a written objection in June 1944 that kept 30,000 people in Paris off a train, an arrest order executed on the night of the 20th of July that took the entire German police apparatus of a capital city into custody without firing a round, a people's court sentence, and a service record that stops at General der Infanterie because there was nowhere else for it to go. He commanded one army for a single campaign season. He ran an occupation for almost 2.5 years. He signed for both. Then he ordered the arrest of the SS, lost the argument at La Roche-Guyon, and stopped a car on ground he had first seen as a young staff officer in the First World War. If your father or grandfather came into Paris in August 1944, or fought through Lorraine and up to the Moselle that autumn, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. That's what the record shows. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.